In defending Ezra Klein's good intentions or the idea that he knows how to create conditions to fight fascism, a lot of people referred to this interview with Congresswoman Sarah McBride. So I went back to watch it, and I noticed this.
An approach that's filled with grace. There is a hunger for some level of grace, for us to just not be so angry at one another and miserable.
McBride's strategic advice in this interview revolves around a theological term. She refers to grace a dozen times. Now, I'm not a biographer of McBride at all, but she's open about growing up at Westminster Presbyterian in Wilmington, Delaware. She served there as a youth elder. She acted in scripture lessons on Christmas, on Palm Sunday. It was a big part of her life. And none of what I'm going to say is meant to take a swipe at her faith or her supportive community or her religious commitments, or certainly her personal bravery as the first openly trans congressperson. I think grace is a beautiful personal and interpersonal virtue, like mindfulness. The question is, can grace and mindfulness understand and counter fascism? And by the way, this is not becoming an Ezra Klein hate page. I just think the conversation around his social and political, maybe even his spiritual function right now is really clarifying. Now, given what I explored in that viral video about the intersection of modern Buddhism with Klein's super calm Riz, I'm looking at this interview a little bit differently now. And I think that what makes it feel uncanny and impenetrably smug for people who are truly on the left is that Klein and McBride share some thinly veiled spiritual ideals that give their liberalism a vibe of moral and civil superiority. But let's back up into the hard politics. Here's the headline. Complete bananas. Now, did Klein write the headline or did McBride sign off on it? Maybe not. Who knows? And even though McBride attempted to hedge against this headline by saying, we're not in this position because of trans people, she then spotlit trans people and trans allies who allegedly made everything worse by being salty on Twitter or concentrating on fringe issues like gender care for minors and generally losing the art of persuasion, as she put it. She thought that these were key factors in the 2024 loss. So when this interview dropped, a lot of liberals listening in felt really good. They were saying, oh, here is a polite, respectable trans person who just wants to live a normal life, and they're not going to yell too much or complicate our high school baseball teams. And that means they'll get their rights and access to medical care bit by bit. And then they'll just be normal like the rest of us, like they surely want to be. Many of you will know that this is letter from Birmingham jail territory. The trans lost for the left argument hinges on the fantasy that if the trans activist narrows their scope and strictly polices their affect, they will beat transphobic propaganda funded by billionaires and they'll win the vote of Joe Sixpack. Run to the center to capture the right. Now, in my opinion, the appeal to respectability vastly underestimates the goals and funding of fascists. And if you think that telling people to stop using pronouns in college settings or throwing gender care for minors under the bus isn't connected to things like eliminating birth control for women generally, you're pretty naive about fascism. Also, if you wonder why McBride is there at all to tell Klein about what he basically wants to hear, you can take a look at Elite Capture by Olufemi Taiwo. I can't recommend this book highly enough. The political tension lies in a contradiction. They want to affirm trans rights to the extent that polling allows, and then things will improve. And this mirrors the contradiction of liberalism itself, which always relies on future promises to launder current cruelties. But what I'm interested in is, how do they sell it? How do Klein and McBride make it sound like they have the moral high ground? I think they pull it off by maintaining an affect of innocence and nobility. You see, what I didn't pick up on at the time is that through the invocation of grace, McBride is kind of telling socially conservative liberals who might be fine with her not having a bathroom that she can use at work, that she will still bless them. She's not going to yell at them. I think that's a huge hook. She's offering absolution to people who won't stand up for her in the hope that someday they will. And what makes this complicated but also relatable to many is that it sounds like a spiritual story. McBride definitely seems unshakable, not ideologically, because as a liberal she's going to compromise. She seems unshakable in that way that faithful people are unshakable in their belief in divine goodness. For McBride, grace is a political goal. Grace in politics means, quote, assuming good intentions, creating space for disagreement. And maybe Klein had this ringing in his ears on the day that Charlie Kirk was shot, and that kept him up all night writing his column. For McBride, grace is a coalition strategy. Grace lowers the temperature on conflict. Maybe this is Klein's instinct in bringing on Ben Shapiro. Grace provides a moral contrast. Let them be vitriolic, and we will respond with grace. But McBride also acknowledges that asking marginalized people to show grace is unfair, but still affirms that grace is nonetheless necessary for persuasion. So I was interested in what the Presbyterians have to say about grace. And ultimately, they say it comes from God. I found a well-cited definition from a prominent minister named Reverend Ethan Rath. Quote, grace is favor, blessing, or goodwill offered by one who does not need to do so. I'm emphasizing some things. It is undeserved. In our sinful condition as humans, undeserving as we are of God's love, it is God's goodwill and favor reaching out to redeem us. So, in this interview, we have on one side a guy who admits he doesn't know what he's doing. He went to the podcast studio, he went to the consultancy meeting, he went to the combination podcast studio and consultancy meeting, and then he did some Buddhist prayers. And across the table from him, we have a middle-of-the-road Democrat talking about offering the spirit of grace in a time of fascism, because if you show grace, your position will be irresistible. I think these are decent people that I would probably enjoy hanging out with, but it's not their time. And the radiant calm that they both deploy in the face of turmoil, that's the famous opiate that the guy with the bigger, messier beard was talking about. And the thing is, we've seen this before. 95 years ago, Dietrich Bonhoeffer realized that the liberal church of Germany, but also the white church of America that he visited in 1930, was unequipped to oppose the rise of fascism. Aside from the centrist politics that governed these congregations, he also said that these liberal churches trafficked in, wait for it, cheap grace, which he said lacked moral discipline and the willingness to stand up to power. It's a kind of grace that's given in the hope of repair without demanding repair. This is like joining in with the community of Kirk's mourners in the belief that you share something universal. Bonhoeffer knew that something more was needed as the Nazis rose, and he found his answer in what he called the costly grace of a radical black church in Harlem. That vision of grace drove him to lead the first loud, uncompromising, and spiritually rooted resistance to the Reich, which culminated in his execution for his role in a foiled plot to assassinate Hitler. I'm not suggesting anything here. I'm pointing to an historical contrast. Costly grace isn't the grandiose hope that your own goodness will persuade fascists. It isn't mindfulness that shrinks history down to the present moment to find equanimity with someone like Ben Shapiro, who doesn't believe trans women exist. Costly grace was at the root of the civil rights movement. It informed MLK Jr. about when the time for persuasion was past, when the time for relying on liberals was past, and when the time for taking radical action had begun.